Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for logging in and joining us for this 25, 30-minute revision webinar, which is going to look at cognitive psychology. We're going to have a look at memory. My name's Jim Riley. I'm your host for tonight, but the webinar will be taken by and led by Joseph. Joseph, just let me check. Are you there, mate?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's cool. We can hear you good. Guys, the format for the webinar is that Joseph will lead the session. We've got the chat window open, so if anybody wants to raise any questions as we're going through the session, feel free to add them in there. I'll be keeping an eye out on that as well to see if there's any common questions. And I think, Joseph, you can also see the chat window as well. Am I right?
I can indeed, yeah.
Yeah, cool. So maybe if there's some questions as we're going along, if you get a chance to pick up on those, Joe, that'd be great. Uh, Joseph, over to you, mate.
Brilliant. Well, welcome everyone. Good to see so many people from yesterday again. Quite a packed session for memory. It's actually probably a trickier topic than yesterday, so quite a lot to get through, focusing on bits of research methods as we go through. So yeah, quite a bit to get through, so let's give it a go. To start with, just to put you into the context, 5 days to go now. So for those of you here yesterday, it was 6. We're down to 5, and of course we've got one last webinar tomorrow looking at attachment before the exam, and hopefully some more being scheduled last minute for Sunday, I'm hoping. So we'll let you know about those. Mentioned this yesterday, but good for those of you that might not have been here. The real importance in the exam this year in comparison to previous years is just the percentage of marks that are awarded for AO2 application and AO3. Nearly 2/3 of your exams will be based on these two assessment objectives, and knowing how to answer these questions is of course vitally important. The sample material for memory or cognitive psychology gives us a few hints of what the exam will look like. Firstly, if we look at the 6 different sample papers across AS and A level, research methods appears in 4 out of 6 of them. So there's a good chance research methods will appear in this section as well. And secondly, 5 out of 6 of them have an essay, which gives me an indication that I think there'll be an essay as well in cognitive psychology, or a high probability at least. Like yesterday, the essays can take one of 2 different forms. It could be outline and evaluate research into eyewitness testimony, or it could be outline and evaluate a theory, like a theory of forgetting, and they can either be 8 marks or 12 marks, and those are evenly weighted between knowledge and evaluation. And then likewise, as I mentioned yesterday, there is also the possibility of an application essay where they add in an extract, and actually we're going to look at probably the hardest question in all of the sample papers today, which looks at proactive and retroactive interference, to see if we can tackle that. It's a particularly difficult question. So that's the kind of structure of your exam for cognitive psychology. 4 main aims really. We're going to look at the language within the exam, practice some AO2 cognitive questions and AO2 research methods questions, look at that really difficult cognitive application essay, and then see if we can predict some things that might come up in the exam using what's already come up in the sample material. Okay, so let's give it a go. To begin with, exam language is really important, and I know for many of my students here they will have seen this, so apologies for repeating myself, but the difference between one word in a question can actually change almost the way you answer an entire question. So if we take, for example, the following question, outline how one research study has investigated the effects of anxiety on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, 4 marks, versus a very similar question, outline what researchers have found in relation to the effects of anxiety on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. Although those 2 questions appear really, really similar, what we find is that the difference of one word changes the entire way that you have to answer that question. It's really, really important you read these questions carefully. To give you an example, if we look here, there's actually only really one word difference between the 2 questions, the word how in question 1 and the word what in question 2. And that actually changes the entire way you answer that question. If a question says how research is investigated, what you're actually looking to include is the method section from the study itself, okay, and still aiming for 4 key points from the method itself. If the question says what researchers have found, in particular found, you're looking to include the results and the conclusion from a study, still including 4 key points, which is actually very, very difficult. So we're going to look at how we might do that now. Now, the study that would go with this, the obvious choice of study, is either what some of you might call Loftus's pen and knife study, or Johnson and Scott, who are the real people that did it. We're going to look at their study, and here's the revision flashcard from that study with the key points from the method and key points from results and conclusion on the screen now. Now, if we were to answer the first question, outline how the study has investigated, we're looking for 4 key things from the methodology only. The minute you include anything else, you're not getting any marks for that question. Okay, and it's really important you just include method points here. So to give you an example, you might say that it was a laboratory experiment and it used an independent groups design. That's going to pick you up a mark for certain. You then might talk about the different conditions in the experiment. You might say that there was a high anxiety condition where the person waiting in the reception overheard sort of a heated discussion and a man ran past with a knife covered in blood, versus a low anxiety condition where they overheard a sort of normal conversation and a man walked past with a pen. That's all part of the method, so that's a couple more points in there. We've said what both the different conditions are. And then finally, you'd go and say what they then had to do was identify the man that walked past them or ran past them from a selection of 50 photographs, okay? Now, the key is there. I've got 4 key points, all from the method. I've not said the aim, I've not said the results, and I've not said the conclusion, deliberately, because they're not worth anything. If we flip over now to the other question, what researchers have found, we can't include any of this previous material because that's all method, so we just need to get straight into the results section, okay? If you go into this, what you then need to be saying is that actually what Johnson and Scott or Loftus found was that in the high anxiety condition, participants identified the man 33% of the time, versus in the low anxiety condition, the pen condition, they identified the man correctly 49% of the time. Now that's only a sort of couple of marks there, so we're going to need to go on to say, well, what can we conclude from that to get the rest of our marks? So what we'd go on to say is that, well, Loftus, and it's Loftus who came up with this idea, suggested that this is due to what we call the weapon focus effect. When we're highly anxious and if there's a weapon involved in a crime, we focus our attention on that weapon, not the person, which therefore reduces our accuracy when it comes to identification. So really, really important. I can't stress this enough that if you get a question like this, don't bother wasting time writing an aim or results and conclusion for the first one because it's only wanting method. And exactly the same for the second one. Don't bother writing the method because they only want the results. So get straight into the actual question itself. Okay? So that's exam language. We're going to move on now to the second part of this session, looking at mastering those AO2 cognitive questions to begin with, okay? And there's a particularly tricky one in the exam that I want us to consider now. So there's one about a girl called Melissa who was on her way to college when she saw a man attack a cyclist and steal his bike. She was really upset by what she'd seen, and when she got to college, everyone wanted to talk to her about it, and Luke asked her whether the man was wearing a brown jacket. The question is really, again, it's in 2 parts. It's quite a tricky question. It says, from the description above, identify 3 factors affecting the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, and then, for the second part, explain how each factor might affect her memory for the event. Okay. Excuse me. Now, the first part of the question is to note that it's got 2 different parts. So it's got these identify the 3 factors, okay, and then this explain how it affects her memory. So we've got to break it into 2 different sections. Now, if we look at the first part to begin with, the word identify simply means state the 3 factors. And this comes back to a point I mentioned yesterday, that if you know the specification, you already know what the answer is going to be, even if you don't read the extract, because there are only 3 factors that we could be listing. So we know that leading questions is going to be one of them. Ross has rightly said on the screen there, post-event discussion is going to be another one, and then anxiety is going to be the third. Okay, and I've highlighted in the extract where they appear. So simply by listing those, we've already identified, so we're really at half marks already. The second part of the question is a bit trickier. So we've identified our factor. What we then need to do is say, how does it affect Melissa's memory? Now, what the temptation here for students to do is simply say why, for example, there is a leading question. So what you could see happening here is that someone could say, okay, one factor is leading questions. For example, Luke asked her whether the man was wearing a brown jacket. Unfortunately, although that is correct and you've applied to the extract beautifully, you've not said actually how it affected her memory. So you've got to be really careful. You've actually got to answer what the question says. So to give you an example, you would say, and again quoting from the extract, Melissa might say that the attacker was wearing a brown jacket. She might do because that's how her memory's been affected. Because Luke asked her whether the man was wearing a brown jacket, and in bold I've quoted the bit from the extract which I've used, which is therefore a misleading question. You then go on and do exactly the same. You say post-event discussion is another factor, okay? But again, simply, you can't just say because everyone wanted to talk to her about it. You have to say, well, how does that affect her memory? And this is trickier. So I'd say, furthermore, as everyone wanted to talk to Melissa about it, so I've quoted, what she might do is then incorporate all of that information from the different conversations she's having with other people into her own memory, and therefore she's going to start to recall things she didn't actually see. Okay, so again, you can see really clearly how I'm answering the question. Last but not least, slightly tricky one, you could say a final factor is that she was anxious. And again, to apply that, we're saying, well, actually, she was really upset. It says that in the extract. And what we know from anxiety is that if you're really upset and anxious, actually that can reduce whether or not you recall accurately, okay? If there was a weapon involved, we could even bring that in and say, well, she's probably not going to remember the person themselves because she focused on the weapon. Okay, so really important question. Don't just go with what you think the question is asking you. Make sure you just say exactly what the examiner is looking for. So how did it affect her memory? Be really clear in your answer. Okay? Moving ourselves on, so what I want to look at now is a different type of AO2 question, but this time research methods question, because there will be definitely research methods questions within your cognitive section. Okay. Now let's imagine we get this question. Okay, quite a tricky question with a graph included. So it says there a psychologist devised a memory test for 200 people. The results are shown in the distribution for graph 1. So I'll put you the graph there. And then the question says the psychologist decides to modify the memory test so that it will produce a more normal distribution. Briefly explain how you might achieve this, okay? Now, quite a tricky question, so I'm actually going to explain it, first of all, not in the context of this particular question, because I think this question is tricky, okay? So let's imagine we're going to rebrand that graph, okay? So instead of being about memory, actually going to make it about intelligence now. Okay, so let's imagine the bottom axis is IQ score, how intelligent we are, and the y-axis is exactly the same. It's still the number of participants taking part. Now, the first thing is that a normal distribution should look like what I've put on screen now. So that's what all normal distributions should look like, okay? Now, with this, if we're talking about IQ, we know that the normal, sort of the mode score we'd be looking for, or the median score for IQ is around 100. Most people have an IQ of 100. Fewer people have a higher IQ. Fewer people have a lesser IQ, okay? Now, this is a really sort of tricky question, because what it's asking you is, why is it that this distribution is negatively skewed, okay? So if we think of this in the context of IQ, if we look at where the graph is now, this would end up being sort of a modal score of about 125 IQ, which is showing us that actually on this particular test, more people had a score of 125, when we know there should really be about 100. So actually the test that they're doing, the intelligence test they're doing, is obviously way too easy because it's negatively skewed. We've got more people essentially beating the IQ that they should have. Which then means if we knew that was the case, we'd just make the test harder. Okay, so quite a tricky question. That's how it would relate to IQ. Let's go back into the context of the question now. So it was on a memory test. Okay, now the way you would look to answer this question is firstly to acknowledge actually what the problem is. Too many participants are getting higher than the middle score, because if we look there, the most common score is above the median score. So too many are getting a higher score than they should be getting. Therefore, what we would say, in order to make that a more normal distribution, the psychologist, that should say, would make the test more difficult, okay, picking up a couple of marks there. What you can do on this, which I think is really, really helpful, is illustrate on the graph what you actually mean by that. So I would then finish my point by saying, well, if we make the test harder, he would achieve a more normal distribution, see the diagram, and I just draw it on, because you can actually get credit for drawing over a graph that's already in the exam paper, which is a useful thing to know on a question like this, okay? So yeah, firstly state why is it that they're actually scoring higher than they should be, then how you would make it actually a normal distribution, and then I would illustrate it on the graph, just to make sure you get those 4 out of 4 marks. So that's the first research methods question I wanted to look at. And then there's just one more that's a very, very common type of research methods question that comes up. Let's imagine you're given the following data set, okay? Condition A, condition B, it doesn't matter what it is, and you've got the scores there, okay? Very, very common question, and I see it all the time, is what's the most appropriate measure of central tendency? So is it the mean, the median, or the mode for both groups, and justify your answer. Now, it's so easy to do this once you know the trick, okay? If we look at those scores, in both conditions, the scores are relatively close together, okay? You can see in condition A, it's anywhere between 4 and 8. In condition B, it's anywhere between 11 and 16. So they're actually quite close together, which means the answer is always the same. The answer is the mean, because with the mean, we take into account all of the data, we add them all up and divide them by the number that's there, which means actually we're not going to have a distorted mean, because there's no scores that are really extreme one end or the other. They're all quite close together, okay? So your answer, mean for 1 mark, and then you say because it takes into account all of the data, there's no extreme scores, or what we call outliers, and therefore the mean won't be distorted. So if your data looks like this, you're always going to say the mean. Absolutely, as Daniel said. And if, however, they give you a similar data set, but what they do deliberately is put in some really extreme scores, so I'll highlight them on screen now. So you can see in condition A, 12 and 16 are obviously quite far away from the rest of the values, and in condition B, 5 and 2 are quite far away. You've got an option here. You can actually go with mode or median. And then your justification is almost exactly the same. For example, if you said median, you'd say it's because it provides a middle value which is not distorted by those extreme scores, those outliers. And then remember, because it's an application question, you should give the example of where those extreme scores are. For example, 12 and 16 in condition A, 5 and 2 in condition B. You could do exactly the same For mode, you could say mode because it provides the most common values, which is not distorted by the presence of outliers again, and then the answer is exactly the same. Okay. I can see someone's asked what standard deviation. Quite often, I'm going to go back actually then to the previous one. Quite often they'll ask you a question along the lines of, what does the standard deviation tell us about the data, for 2 marks again. Now you can see in condition B here the standard deviation is 2.62, okay, and therefore as a result of that what you would say is that the spread of scores in this set of data is much more larger. There's more variability in the data in comparison to the spread of scores in condition A. So it's just looking at how spread out our scores are. So range and standard deviations are measures of dispersion, so how dispersed our data is. I don't need to answer, people are doing it for me. Brilliant. And last but not least, I want to tackle probably what is one of the hardest questions I've seen in any of the sample papers so far, okay? And I know this has caused me and my students some headaches, so we'll look at it here. It says here, Martin's studying for a modern languages exam. He revises French followed by Spanish on the same night and then gets confused between the two. For example, he remembers the French word for chair instead of the Spanish word for chair. Sometimes his mum helps test Martin's vocabulary. When he's unable to remember the word, his mum tells him the first letter and then he can often recall it. Okay. It says discuss 2 explanations for forgetting, referring to Martin's experiences in your answers, okay, for 12 marks. As I said yesterday, the key is with these application essays is really not to panic, because the application part, all of that extract, is actually only worth 2 marks. So when you know that, your actual ability to apply, you're not really going to be putting that much in the exam. So don't panic about the application bit. The rest of the essay is really important. Okay, about 15 minutes I would advise for a 12-mark question. Now, again, this comes back to my earlier point. If you know the specification, you know that there are just 2 explanations of forgetting. Interference is one explanation, which includes proactive and retroactive, and retrieval failure is the other, which actually includes 3 things I've discovered through looking at the mark schemes. You can have context-dependent retrieval failure, state-dependent retrieval failure, and then something called organisational, which I've only spotted through the mark scheme, so it's interesting AQA have picked that up in the mark schemes. Something that will help you, definitely with the interference, is for proactive, if you can remember that the P is for past learning interferes with new learning, so the P will help you there. Retroactive, recent learning or new learning is interfering with old learning, so that will just help you remember those 2 key terms for interference, okay? Now the first thing, as I mentioned in yesterday's webinar, so if you haven't seen it, it'd be worth watching on YouTube now, is that actually the application bit is going to come right at the end. I'll answer what organisational is in a moment. So actually, you're writing the essay as if the extract wasn't there to begin with. So to give you an example, you make your point. So you'd say one explanation of forgetting is that of interference. You define what you mean by that. Interference can be either proactive, where old learning interferes with new, or retroactive, where new learning interferes with old. You then, of course, as I mentioned yesterday, because this is a theories question, you need to bring in your supporting evidence to support that point. So I would say here that evidence to support the idea of interference comes from Badley and Hitch's research on rugby players. What they found was that the people that have played the most games in a season forgot more of the team names than those who have played fewer games due to injury. That was the findings. I then have to explain how that supports interference. Well, I'd say this supports the idea of interference, in particular retroactive, as the new information, new team names, interfered with the players' abilities to recall old team names. Now, I haven't applied to Martin yet, and actually at the moment this is a very good essay, because remember the AO 2 marks are only worth actually 2 marks overall. Now we've got to get our head around the extract. So if we go back to it, the key is here that Martin studied the French first before then going on to the Spanish. He's revised French, gone on to Spanish. Then when he tries to remember a Spanish word for chair, he actually remembers the French word. So that French word, the old learning, is interfering with his new, which therefore means it's going to be an example of proactive interference in this case. Okay. Now we know that, we can go back to our answer, and that is checked with the mark scheme, so that's exactly right. We can go back to our answer and say, well, actually, Martin's experiencing interference. Okay. And notice I've not really said the type. I'm going to put that in brackets because interference is a whole explanation of forgetting, because his old learning is interfering with his ability to remember the Spanish. Okay. Now, if you got it the wrong way round, if you've left it till the end, it actually really doesn't matter. Let's say, for example, you put Martin's experiencing interference, it's retroactive. You've still tried to apply, so they're not going to bring you down, But the rest of your essay on the interference, because you spoke about interference generally, is correct. So you're going to pick up all the marks there. So my advice is, if it's a forgetting question, don't be specific in your point and your evidence. Talk about the theory generally, interference, and then apply at the end. And if you get it right, fantastic, you're going to pick up that extra mark. If you get it wrong, you're not going to bring down the rest of your marks, okay? I can see that some of you already jumped on to answering my next point. I'm not going to explain the next one. On the handout that accompanies this session, I'm going to let you have the go at trying to answer the next point yourself, okay? Many of you have picked up absolutely right. So you'd say another explanation of forgetting is retrieval failure. You would go on to explain what we mean by retrieval failure. So this is very simply the idea that information is never forgotten. It's still in our memories, but we just can't access the information. We can't get it back out, okay? You then bring evidence in to support that point, okay? So you'd say evidence to support the idea of interference comes from a study by Godden and Bailey on deep sea divers. They found, and you go on to say what they found, okay? Chiara, the handout will come at the end of the session. We'll tell you where to find that. And then you say how Godden and Bailey's study supports the idea of interference, okay? Of retrieval failure in this case. Okay, and then last but not least, you bring into Martin. I've spotted a typo on there, so it should say evidence supports the idea of retrieval failure, that should say, so just be aware of that. I'll change that when I send it around. So I'll let you work through that one on your own, but you've got the structure and the format to help you with that. And if you did both of those, referring back to Martin, who is experiencing organizational cue-dependent failure, then you pick up your marks. Now, what we mean by organizational is the idea that his mum's given him the first letter, so she's helping him to organise his knowledge. She's giving him the C, which will then help him to remember the rest of the word in French, okay? So yeah, that example is just basically cueing you to remember the rest of the word, okay? But again, if you didn't know the exact type that it was organisational, just talking about retrieval failure would be enough to get you through that particular question, okay? And that's how you would structure it. Okay, last but not least, again, I'm going to mention some sort of exam predictions, but remember, I'm not actually saying I know exactly what's coming up in the exam. These are just looking at the sample assessment materials to really try and sort of work out where the common questions actually occur. Okay, so if we look at the 3AS sample papers that are out there, the first thing that really sort of springs to mind is that research methods is going to be in this section somewhere. Okay, so you're probably going to have a research methods question. It's more likely to fit in here than it is in social because of all the studies in memory and eyewitness testimony. The second thing that really jumps out is that there has been an essay in every single one of the AS sample assessment materials, which would then lend itself to really putting in an essay question in this section as well. Okay. Last but not least, really sort of common application questions in terms of eyewitness testimony and memory can come up here. Okay. So yeah, really obvious place to put in different types of application questions. So I think personally, there might be some research method questions heading your way, and I'm pretty certain to say there could be an essay as well in this particular section of the paper. And that brings us to the end. So again, what we'll do, as the same as yesterday, in tomorrow morning's Psychology Daily Digest, we'll send through the PowerPoint and the accompanying handout. We'll just let you sort of work your way through these examples from this session. The session will be again uploaded to YouTube, so you can watch it again in your own leisure time. And that brings us to the end. So Jim, back to you if you spotted any questions I've missed. Any questions? I'm free to answer.
You've been fantastic as usual, Joseph, picking up the questions and the contributions as we've been going through. I guess we've got a minute or so. Should we just see if anybody else has got any further questions that you want to pick up?
Yes.
Let's just roll for a minute or two, see if there's anything, maybe one or two questions just to pick up if there's anything new that we need to cover.
Zoe, no, you don't need to remember names of studies. As long as you describe them accurately, they'll know who you mean. So yes, Jennifer, this is a good one. This idea of the three types of forgetting in terms of organisational, state dependent, and context dependent. Okay, the idea with these is context dependent forgetting is the idea that we remember information if we learn it in the same environment as where we recall it. So that Godden and Badley diver study, Badley and Hitch diver study rather, is the idea that the divers that learn the words on land best record them on land, and those that learn the words underwater best record them underwater. The idea of mood or state dependent is that if you learn information in a particular mood, you recall it better in the same mood. And there was the great study by Goodwin where participants were either drunk or sober, and then the next day they either had to get drunk or sober again. And what they found is that participants who learn words when drunk best remembered those words when drunk. Finally, organisational is the idea that if we can organise the information that we need to recall into sort of a hierarchy, so have a trigger that helps us to remember it, that way we will be able to remember it. So by giving someone the first letter of a word, it will help them remember the word, which is the idea of sort of tip on the tongue. If you help someone to remember something by giving them a prompt, they will remember it. Okay. So actually the flashcards that you can see on screen now are a great example of that. By looking at the front of the flashcard, the idea is it will trigger your memory of what's on the reverse of it.
Joseph, it looks like there's quite a few questions there. What I mentioned right at the start on the chat is that obviously we're around on Twitter. If you connect with the @tutor2psych handle on Twitter, that's a good way, I guess, Joseph. If anybody else has got any further follow-up questions or comments on the session, as Joseph mentioned, this has been recorded, so we'll upload this to YouTube tonight. It'll appear on the Daily Digest. If you sign up on the Tutor2 Psychology channel, you get a daily digest each day with new revision resources, new materials, and so that I guess the handout and that link will be on there in the morning, which will be a cool thing to have. I mean, just looking at the screen though, Joseph, you've got the flashcards.
There's a few more. Yes.
So just whilst you're having a look at those questions, I think there's literally a day left. We can get the flashcards out to people if they buy them from the online store. We'll send them out first class tomorrow. So you'd need to go on the online store and grab a set of those if you'd like those to help prepare for the exams next week and the week after. Any more questions you picked up at all, Joe? Or
I can see, yeah, I didn't realise that they weren't. My screen wasn't scrolling up, so I just spotted all of these questions. How much research methods questions could there be? The maximum I've seen in the memory section is up to 10 marks worth of research methods questions, so it can be quite a high percentage in this particular section. Eva's question, how many evaluation points for an outline and evaluate 4-marker? I've seen that question, Eva. You're referring to the briefly outline and briefly evaluate. It'll be one small descriptive point and one small evaluation point. How many paragraphs in a 12-marker? Well, your outline itself would be sort of one, it depends on the question, you're looking at one sort of main paragraph for your outline with 6 key points, and then you're looking for 3, sort of aiming for 3 evaluative paragraphs. Yesterday's webinar actually covered the 2 different types of essay questions, so if you didn't see it, it'd be really great to have a look at yesterday's one because it talks you really through nice and clearly the 2 different types of essay questions. Do we need to know studies into long-term memory and short-term memory? Yes, I would advise it. I think it's good to have at least one up your sleeve for both of those. So for long-term memory, Barrick's study is a really great one, and for short-term memory, there's a couple. There's Miller's Magic Number 7, and then there's Peterson and Peterson, which looked at duration. I've answered that one. Samir, do you need to know studies into capacity duration? No, as long as you, my advice there is have a study at least for short-term and long-term memory, and those I literally just mentioned. Oh, someone's done that for me underneath. Brilliant, thank you. It's the same questions coming up. I think I've answered many of those questions.
That's fantastic. Well, Joe, we've come to the end of we've come to the end of our 30 minutes. So on behalf of everybody, again, massive thanks, guys. Thanks for logging in to the webinar. Hopefully you found it useful. I think we have another one tomorrow, which I think may already be full, but I know we're looking at trying to run some overflow revision webinars between now and the exam, and obviously there's some more next week ahead of the second paper. But for now, guys, I'm going to thank Joseph for what a fantastic webinar, a wonderful thing, really useful revision webinar. It'll be on YouTube shortly, and guys, continue with your revision, keep preparing, keep in touch, and we'll sign off now and end the session. Thank you.